Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you very much for the rain this week. We had a little bit too much of it in some cases, but much better than hot, humid weather that we're used to in August and September. And it makes the grass grow and the flowers. We're also blessed to be able to gather around the table and discuss your word, what we can learn about you and from you. And please bless the folks around the table and those who are not here today. In thy name we pray. Amen. Amen. Well, last Sunday, we started talking about the documentary hypothesis. It's also called the JEPD theory, and it maintains really that there were four sources or traditions that were compiled to create the Hebrew Bible, pretty much the Old Testament. I thought this was an appropriate thing to kind of digress. It's really not a digression. It's really not a digression. It's a method to explain some of the problems, the discrepancies, the errors, the differences between some of the stories that we are going to read in Genesis. Now remember, this JEPD theory is really just a theory. We don't have any of the JEPD ancient documents or manuscripts that we can point to support them. This is an analysis over a period of about 600 years that Bible scholars have done. Initially, you recall, they had some problems with things they called doublets. The two creation stories. One will start chapter 1 next week, and then in a week or two after that, we'll start into verses in chapter 2. Why are there two creation stories? They don't sound the same. They call God a different God. And so they got them wondering why that is. And then when you look at the Noah story, for example, it's got two stories. They're kind of interwoven, whereas the creation stories are separated. There are two versions of the Ten Commandments. There are two areas where the covenant is explained in a different way. In one of the commandments is explained differently in one area of the Bible and differently in others. So the scholars said, well, why is this? Why are we seeing these differences? And so over a period of time, they've developed this idea that there are principally four sources to the Pentateuch. Now, I said last Sunday that the Assyrian conquest of Israel in 722 BC is a very significant chapter in the history of the Near East. It changed the social and the economic and the religious landscape in Judah as a result. That environment that produced the Yahwist, the Jehovah, the J source, and the Elohim, or the E source, was gone. The northern kingdom of Israel, which produced the E source, was no more. The southern kingdom of Judah that produced the J source had a lot of refugees come in, and the entire landscape, the national landscape, had changed. So the environment, the political environment, the national environment that created those two documents changed. Now the other two traditions, the Deuteronomistic source, the D source, and the priestly source, the P source, will come into play. The actual number of sources, we say there are four, is probably overly simplified. There may have been more, but that's what the scholars point to nowadays. And it's still a matter of debate. It's not solved. Since we have no ancient documents to support either one of those, all we have is a in-depth analysis of the scriptures. There's still a lot of debate going on as to whether or not that's true. But I really strongly feel that knowing some of this background will help us understand the Bible and the way it's written. Now, to sort of pull all of this together, we need a brief history lesson, which I promised last week, and so that's what we're going to do this morning. And we will be diving into the Bible to support some of this history that we're talking about. Now, during the relatively stable years of Kings David and Solomon, the scribes in the royal court and in the temple, and remember, the kings were divinely appointed, and so we're talking about a theocracy where the king is a representative of God and they run the government. There's no separation of church and state like we have in the United States today. They were tied together through the king appointed by God. So those, whoever they were, those officials in David and Solomon's court began to gather the historical record of the Israelites. And you can see why that would be true. Think of all the Psalms, and the country was typically at peace. It was a great time of building expansion. Solomon was a great builder. There was a lot of literacy, and David had something like 1,000 choir members, and of course he was writing psalms, and there was great celebration and a lot of fanfare and a lot of royal stuff. And so you can well imagine somebody saying, or the king saying, hey, we need to gather the history of our people. This is a great time. We need to support that. Then, so that was the source of the J source, the Jehovah source. Now, following Solomon's death in 922 BC, there was a brief war between the two kingdoms, between Israel and Judah. Israel to the north and Judah to the south. And they separated. So the monarchy split, which had been unified under David and Solomon, now split. The boundary line was just north of Jerusalem. Saul was a member of the tribe of Benjamin, and if you remember a little bit about what the tribal territories were like, Benjamin was just to the north of Jerusalem, and then everything north of Benjamin was Israel, and everything south was Judah. So in that split monarchy, while the J source was being developed in Jerusalem continued, there was another source that was developed in the south, we think centralized at the location of the city of Shiloh. Shiloh was a well-known religious center. It had been the capital, actually, of Israel proper for like 300 years before David established Jerusalem as the capital. That's where the tabernacle was. That's where the Ark of the Covenant was until David moved it into the city. So let's go as our first reading, 1 Chronicles chapter 15. First Chronicles chapter 15, the first 4 verses. After David had constructed buildings for himself in the city of David, he prepared a place for the ark of the Lord and pitched a tent for it. Then David said, "No one but the Levites may bring the ark of God, because the Lord chose them to carry the ark of the Lord and to minister before him forever." David assembled all Israel in Jerusalem to bring up the ark of the Lord to the place he had prepared for it. He called together the descendants of Aaron and the Levites. We're going to hear about the Levites. The Levites was the tribe of Levi, one of the sons of Jacob, and they became responsible for the maintenance and tabernacle, and later, after Solomon built the temple, they were responsible for the temple. The priests who administered rites and offered sacrifices in the temple were of the tribe of Levi. They were called Levites. And so, but there were several descendants of Levi. They were all descendants of Aaron, the first priest. And so there were, let's say, just say, competing elements within the Levite tribe and within the priesthood. So you notice that the Levites, and in this case, the Levites who were descended from Aaron, well known in that line were Eli. You remember Eli, the high priest, and Samuel, who was the boy born of Hannah, who lived in Levi, and Levi was responsible for the tabernacle. He was an Aaronite. He was of the line of Aaron. They were in Shiloh. Shiloh was outside the country of Judah. And of course, when Assyria attacked and conquered Israel, the priests who were at Shiloh, like a lot of the refugees from that war-torn country, went south, and the priests obviously went into Jerusalem. So you have the priests of Shiloh, and you have the priests of Jerusalem. The priests of Shiloh, they bring their document, their Elohim document, and so they have competing narratives of the nation of Israel. At some point, those priests combined those two traditions. They combined the J source and the E source. And if you look on your chart, the J source is all the pink, and the E source is all the green. And you can see it scattered, except for the book of Leviticus and just a little bit in the book of Deuteronomy. You can see that the bulk of what's there is made up of the J and E sources. Now, let's go to 2 Kings, chapter 17. Second Kings chapter 17, verse 1. In the 12th year of Ahaz, king of Judah, Hosea, son of Elah, became king of Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 9 years. He did evil in the eyes of the Lord, but not like the kings of Israel who preceded him. Shalmaneser, king of Assyria, came up to attack Hosea, who had been Shalmaneser's vassal and had paid him tribute. But the king of Assyria discovered that Hosea was a traitor, for he had sent envoys to So, king of Egypt, and he no longer paid tribute to the king of Assyria as he had done year by year. Therefore, Shalmaneser seized him and put him in prison. The king of Assyria invaded the entire land, marched against Samaria, and laid siege to it for 3 years. In the 9th year of Hoshea, the king of Assyria, captured Samaria and deported the Israelites to Assyria. He settled them in Halah and Gozan on the Harbor River in the town of Medes. So, 722 BC, Assyria conquers Israel. So we have the J&E sources meeting in Jerusalem after Assyria conquers. They're combined. Separately, there's another source called the Deuteronomistic, the D source, being created. That source, basic theology was that all the bad things that had happened to Israel, all the bad kings, was a failure of the Israelites to follow the covenant, and therefore was God's punishment. And we read that over and over again. This Deuteronomic source was lost, but found by King Josiah in 622 BC. Now, we read that last week in 2 Kings chapter 22, where Josiah sent his secretary to remodel. They collected money, they remodeled the temple, and in the process discovered this book of law. And they brought the book of law to Josiah. He read it. What he read told him that the Israelites had failed to follow the law. He shred his clothes in grief, and that created a great religious revival. Jeremiah, who wrote the book of Jeremiah, was a priest from Shiloh. He was in the same places that Deuteronomy shows up in an analysis of the writings within the book. And so the other thing is, if you read some of the history books, the book of Jeremiah reads very much like these other history books. So the scholars have surmised that Jeremiah was probably the author of the Deuteronomic history. And in fact, it includes not only the book of Deuteronomy, which you see in blue on your diagram, but it also includes the next 7 books: Judges, Joshua, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Kings, not Chronicles, however. Now, later on, we know that Judah was conquered by Babylon in 587 BC, and that's when the first exile occurred. So while the priests and the leaders, remember, Babylon took all the leaders, all the aristocrats, all the wealthy back to Babylon. That's the story of Daniel. Daniel was just a teenager, and he was in one of those early exiles. And Daniel eventually rose up to be an important person in the Persian government, which later had conquered Babylon. So all of these leaders, a key element of the priesthood, began to rewrite the history of the Israelites. And they wrote it from a different perspective than what they had earlier. What did they have earlier? They had the holy city of Jerusalem, they had the temple, they had all the rituals associated with the temple. And what did they have in Babylon? Nothing. So their religious identity, which had been tied to Jerusalem and tied to the temple, was no longer their identity. And so the book of Deuteronomy and the history that follows rewrites the history of the people and identifies them through a right relationship with God, which was found through proper worship and a strict code of law. Temple worship had ended. So following the law became the thing that was most important as a religious identity to the Hebrews. Now, this P document now shows up, likely written by Aaronite priests from the tribe of Levi, who revised the J&E source to include the first 4 books of the Bible. So if you look at your diagram again, and you look at, other than Deuteronomy, what do you see? You see pink, yellow, and green, right? So those 3 sources, the J, E, and the P source, has been rewritten by this priestly group of people in exile. Go to 2 Chronicles chapter 36. Second Chronicles 36, verse 15. The Lord, the God of their fathers, sent word to them through this messengers again and again, because he had pity on his people and on his dwelling place. But they mocked God's messengers, despised his words, and scoffed at his prophets, until the wrath of the Lord was aroused against his people, and there was no remedy. Does that sounds like what I just said, right? That they, their sins, the failure to follow the law, and the tenets of their religion caused them to be punished by God. He brought up again against them the king of the Babylonians, who killed their young man with the sword in the sanctuary, and spared neither young man nor young woman, old men or aged. God handed all of them over to Nebuchadnezzar, who carried to Babylon all the articles from the temple of the Lord, both large and small, and the treasures of the Lord's temple, and the treasures of the king and his officials. They set fire to God's temple, and they broke down the wall of Jerusalem. They burned all the palaces and destroyed everything of value. He carried them into exile to Babylon, the remnant who escaped from the sword, and they became servants to him and his sons until the kingdom of Persia came to power. The land enjoyed its Sabbath rests. All the time of its desolation it rested until the 70 years were completed in fulfillment of the word of the Lord spoken by Jeremiah. So while they're there, the priestly document is developed, and they combine the other 2 traditions, the other 3 traditions together. So when the returning Jewish aristocracy and the priesthood, right, after 70 years, everybody, Ezra and Nehemiah, come back. Ezra really didn't come back until, I think it's 12 years after the first return of the exile. So he comes later. Nehemiah first goes back to lay the foundation of and build the walls of Jerusalem. So when the Jewish aristocracy and the priests come out of exile to join the farmers and the Levites who had been left behind, they needed a unified vision of who they were. So first, J&E source, split kingdom. After Assyria is conquered, the J&E sources are combined. The Deuteronomic source begins to be developed. Babylon conquers the rest of Judah, takes everybody into exile, and you have all 4 sources. Now you have the J&E source, which had been developed. You have the Deuteronomic source, which had been developed, and now you have the priestly source developed in exile. And now all these folks come back, okay? They have all of these. Some of them have been there for 250 years. Some of these written traditions have been there for 250 years. But they needed a unified message. Right now, all of these sources are in existence, but they haven't been collected together. They each have elements of the priesthood who support each of their different versions. It's not unlike the denominations that we have today, right? What's the difference between us and the Baptists, except for some of the man-made interpretations of Scripture, like baptism or what's a sacrament? The recent General Conference means that Episcopals and United Methodists now can share communion together. What was the difference before? We couldn't before, now we can. What decided that? Well, it was people getting together and deciding, based on some religious interpretation. It's a man-made sort of thing, right? So these different histories of the Jewish people were created in order to support the condition in which they existed when they were created, whether it was a split monarchy, whether it was everybody in exile in Babylon, and now they're coming back to Babylon, from Babylon, and needed a new vision, a new thing that would help them grow together. Go to Nehemiah chapter 8. Nehemiah chapter 8, verse 1. When the 7th month came and the Israelites had settled in their towns, so everybody, this is after Darius said, you guys can all go back, you can build your temple, start your nation again. All the people assembled as one man in the square before the water gate. That was one of the main gates of Jerusalem. They told Ezra the scribe to bring out the book of the law of Moses, which the Lord had commanded for Israel. So on the first day of the 7th month, Ezra the priest brought the law before the assembly, which was made up of men and women and all who were able to understand. He read it aloud from daybreak until noon as he faced the square before the water gate in the presence of the men, women, and others who could understand. And all the people listened attentively to the book of the law. Ezra was an Aaronite priest and a writer. He arrived in Jerusalem with 2 documents, the Torah, the book of the law, which it says right here, and a letter from the Persian emperor that said, go back and rebuild the temple. You have the authority to do that. It is likely that that book of the law that Ezra brought back was the complete 5 books of the Pentateuch, the book of the law, the 5 books of Moses. Now, the person who assembled the 4 J, E, and P, D sources into the 5 books of Moses is called a redactor. And the best way I can think of a redactor is being an editor. The redactor arranged the text that had already been written, so he doesn't really rewrite anything or write anything. He puts them all together. If you look on your chart, you'll see at the bottom it's gray, right? A redactor. And if you look scattered throughout several of the books early on, you'll see a gray line, a single gray line. Well, that was written to kind of tie the things together. It's like when I'm typing my dad's memoirs, okay? And if my dad mentioned something that wouldn't make sense to anybody, I would put an editorial comment. You put square brackets and you write something that explains, I write something that explains what my dad meant or said. And so when you read that, you know it's an editor's comment. Well, that's what the redactor does. The redactor himself was from the Aaronite priests who were in authority. So all the folks come back from exile, They obviously have a bureaucracy of sorts. They're trying to establish their religious identity. They're building the temple, and who would be in charge of building the temple? The priests. So the Aaronite priests, who now have become the dominant, I'll say, political force amongst the priests. We still have the Shiloh line of priests, okay? So they come back and they're responsible for providing the religious leadership within this new community and tying them together. Only one Aaronite priest had the power, the knowledge, and the understanding to lead this effort. Ezra had the backing of the emperor, and he had the enforcement powers because he has a letter of authority from the emperor. And even though he wasn't the high priest, he had tremendous authority. And his authority was directly linked to the scroll that we just read about, that he brought back to Judah from exile, which represented what Moses had been given by God. So think about this now. Ezra was a priest. He was a lawgiver and a scribe. In other words, he was a student of the scriptures. He had access to the documents. He brought them back with him. And the Bible is pretty explicit about the documents that interested him. Go to Ezra chapter 7. Ezra 7, chapter 7, verse 1. After these things, during the reign of Artaxerxes, king of Persia, Ezra, son of, and there's a whole bunch of names in there, Hilkiah, Zadok. Zadok was a priest under, I think, Solomon, the son of Ahitub, the son of Amariah, the son of Azariah, and so on and so forth. Remember Phinehas? He was the son of Eli. The son of Aaron, right? The high priest. So Ezra is of the Aaronite priesthood. This Ezra came up from Babylon. He was a teacher, a scribe, a learner of, a student of the scriptures, well versed in the law of Moses, which the Lord, the God of Israel, had given. The king had granted him everything he asked for. The hand of the Lord, his God, was on him. Some of the Israelites, including priests, Levites, singers, gatekeepers, temple servants, also came up to Jerusalem in the 7th year of Artaxerxes. Ezra arrived in Jerusalem in the 5th month of the 7th year of the king. He had begun his journey from Babylon on the 1st day of the 1st month, and he arrived in Jerusalem on the 1st day of the 5th month. For the gracious hand of God was on him, for Ezra had devoted himself to the study and observance of the law of the Lord, and to teaching its decrees and laws in Israel. He was a devoted servant to the written history of the Israelites. It appears from the scriptures that we have we find the first full Torah of Moses in Judah, the first 5 books of the law, in possession of who? Ezra. Of course, we don't have proof of all this, but Ezra was in the right place, the right priestly family, in the correct profession, at the right time, with the authority, and the first known copy of the book of law. I mean, that's a lot of circumstantial evidence, but in fact, they are fingerprints of what we suspect. And so we think that Ezra was the redactor. He was the guy that took the J&E source that had been around for 250 years, the D source, the priestly source that had been developed in Babylon, brought them all back with him. And whether he started in Babylon and finished in Israel, or whether he finished in Israel, started and finished it, we don't really know. So the next question is, why would he do it? All of these source texts were famous. In other words, they had been around for a long time. As I mentioned, J&E sources have been around for 250 years. D sources have been read at the time of Josiah. Remember, Josiah was the king where they found the Deuteronomic source in the temple. And in fact, the book of law required that these laws, this book, be read every 7 years. That's interesting. Go to Deuteronomy chapter 31. And this adds credence to the fact that these things were well known. It's not like they were obscure. And this gives us a reason to believe why the redactor did what he did and the way he did it. Chapter 31, verse 9. So Moses wrote down this law and gave it to the priests, the sons of Levi, who carried the Ark of the Covenant of the Lord, and to all the elders of Israel. Then Moses commanded them, at the end of every 7 years, in the year for canceling debts, during the Feast of Tabernacles, when all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing. Assemble the people, men, women, and children, and aliens living in your towns, so that they can listen and learn to fear the Lord your God, and follow carefully all the words of the law. Their children who do not know this law must hear it and learn it, to fear the Lord your God as long as you live in the land and you are crossing the Jordan to possess. It happened when Josiah discovered the book of Deuteronomy. That's one of the things he read. That verse that we read, he assembled everybody at the water gate and he read the law to them, because it was required in the law to do this every 7 years. It had been around for so long that nobody would have accepted a redacted document that didn't include the story of Adam and Eve. What story is that? Chapter 2. What sources is chapter 2 of Genesis? What color is it?
The priest?
Yeah.
Oh,
No?
the Jehovah.
Right.
Oh.
Chapter 2, 4b through 25. Adam and Eve, the Garden of Eden, right? How about the golden calf? Everybody remembers the story of the golden calf. Where is that?
It's Exodus 32.
Okay, Exodus 30. And what source is that?
The E source.
How about Leviticus?
It's all P.
All P source. How about Moses' farewell speech? That would be in Deuteronomy. Okay? If you left any of those stories out, just like today, if we put together a Bible and it didn't include the story of the Magi, would you accept that? No. So the same thing existed back then. All of these stories had been there. They were all particular to a particular source for particular reasons why they were written and the way they were written. So when the redactor went to put together these into a couple books, it wouldn't have made sense to him. It wouldn't have made sense to the people. It wouldn't have been accepted by the people had he not included all of them. The Shiloh priests who had produced the E&D documents may not have been in power. The Aaronite priests were in power now, but the Shiloh priests may not have been in power, but they also had influence. So they wouldn't have accepted, they wouldn't have allowed any combination of these books to be produced without their documents that they favored. So the redactor decided to put them all together as opposed to having 4 volumes. Okay? By this time, all of those sources had been attributed to Moses. So this redactor took on think about this now. We read this Bible and we accept the story and we find these discontinuities in it, right? And we're going to talk about some of those. But this redactor had to take all of these sources, put them all together, and get agreement from all the folks who were still influencers for these 4 sources. So the question is, how did he do it? Well, the person who did it, he reminds me of Paul. I mean, you know, we accredit Paul for the spread of Christianity through the ancient Gentile world, and it really caused Christianity to blossom. All right? He was a rabbi. He knew the law. He was well educated. He could communicate. I mean, he had all the right credentials. Well, Ezra is kind of the same kind of guy. He is a priest. He's educated. He's interested in all of these books. And he's part of the leadership that comes back from Babylon to kind of pull everybody together. So he took on this, I would say, enormous, intricate, and ironic task to combine all of these versions of the same stories together. He had to have exceptional literary sensitivity and exceptional writing skills. He had to understand which contradictions were acceptable, contradictions that we have talked about. He put them in, and at the time, they were contradictions, I'm sure, but they were acceptable, not necessarily perfect, but they were a good compromise at the time. He had to take stories that were never meant to go together, to have them flow comfortably. When we get to the story of the flood, we've all read that story or had the story written to us. It all sounds sensible to us, but in reality, there are 2 different stories of the flood. And you can take them out of context and you can read them separately and it will make sense to you. The same thing is true if you took all of these pink items in the first several books of the Bible and you read them just by themselves, it would make sense to you. It's not like you may recognize that it's missing something only because you learned that something from another source. But if you read that, it would make sense to you. It flows comfortably. His only guidelines, it appears to be that he was going to use everything that he had available to him. It's interesting what he did. He took 2 creation stories and he put those side by side, chapter 1 and chapter 2. He took two completely fled stories and he wove them together into a single story. He took the J&E source of the covenant of Abraham and he put it in Genesis 15, and then he took the P source of the same covenant and he put it in Genesis 17. Go to those two chapters. Genesis 15 first. So if you look on your chart, Genesis 15 is the JE source. And I'll start at verse 3. I'll skip around a little bit. And Abraham said, "You have given me no children, so a servant of my household will be my heir." Then the word of the Lord came to him, "This man will not be your heir, but a son coming from your own body will be your heir." He took him outside and said, "Look up at the heavens and count the stars. If indeed you can count them." Then he said to him, "So shall your offspring be." Abraham believed the Lord and credited it to him as righteousness. Skip over to verse 13. Then the Lord said, "Know for certain that your descendants will be strangers in a country not their own, and they will be enslaved and mistreated for 400 years. I will punish the nation they serve as slaves, and afterward they will come out with great possessions. You, however, will go to your fathers in peace and be buried at a ripe old age. In the 4th generation, your descendants will come back here, for the sin of the Amorites has not yet reached its full measure." So that's one covenant. Then go to chapter 17. Verse 3. Abraham fell face down, and God said to him, "As for me, this is my covenant with you. You will be the father of many nations. No longer will you be called Abram. Your name will be Abraham. For I have made you a father of many nations. I will make you very fruitful. I will make nations of you, and kings will come from you. I will establish my covenant as an everlasting covenant between me and you and your descendants after you for the generations to come, to be your God and the God of your descendants after you. The whole land of Canaan, where you are now an alien, I will give as an everlasting possession to you and your descendants after you, and I will be their God." The 4th commandment. Look at Exodus chapter 20. Everybody remember what the 4th commandment is? Yep. The Sabbath. Exodus 20, verse 8. And when I read these, I want you to recognize what's the justification for keeping the Sabbath holy. Okay? "Remember the Sabbath day by keeping it holy. 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, for then the 7th day, a Sabbath to your Lord your God. On it you shall not do any work, neither you, nor your son, nor daughter, nor your manservant, maidservant, nor your animals, nor the alien within you. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and earth, the sea, and all that is in them, but he rested on the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and made it holy." Go to Deuteronomy chapter 5. Verse 12. "Observe a Sabbath day by keeping it holy, as the Lord your God has commanded you." I'm going to skip down to verse 15. "Remember that you were slaves in Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out of there with a mighty hand and an outstretched arm. Therefore the Lord your God has commanded you to observe the Sabbath day." So what's the justification for the Sabbath in the Exodus? Creation story, right? So God, what is it here? Freed from slavery. They reflect the two traditions. They're not the same tradition, but the redactor has put them together. So let me see if I can collect all this together. So Ezra Redactor edited 4 sets of tradition, the J, E, P, and D documents, into one compendium, modeling it on the success of the J and E document that was produced in Jerusalem after the Assyrians conquered Israel. He's often called the second Moses. Moses was the lawgiver. He is called the second Moses because he is suspected to have put together the books of Moses, the books of the law. His intricate work was so accepted so completely that for over 200 years, people accepted the Pentateuch as having had one author by one person, Moses. Actually, Moses lived 500 years before there was a written form of Hebrew. The Jewish Torah became the foundation of the Hebrew culture, an important part of our own Christian Old Testament. Now, I don't want to give you the false impression that this is all factual. The 4-source theory is certainly factual. However, it's still hotly debated. Not because of the idea that the ancient authors had sources that they relied on, but rather that it's probably oversimplistic, that you could narrow it down to 4 sources. So over the past 110 years, the identity of the D source and the priestly source, they've been pretty consistent. Their writing styles, their theology, they probably represent schools of thought rather than the author, a single author, but they're pretty consistent. You don't get too much disagreement about, the P source and the D source. However, the J and E source, of course, it's much older, doesn't necessarily have the same cohesion because its writing and the theologies and the distinctions are not as clear. One of the obvious distinctions is the name for God, right? In the Jehovah source, he is Jehovah, Yahweh, and in the other source, the E source, he's Elohim. And there are two different characteristics of God, as we'll see when we read chapter 1. If you look in your chart, chapter 1 is the P source, right? Chapter 2 and 3 are the J source. I guess this is a situation where you can actually say the documentary evidence of the Pentateuch and the rest of the Old Testament is so much greater than the sum of its parts. I mean, I've tried to break it down for you. I've tried to explain to you how one theory tells us how all of this got together and how we think that the redactor was Ezra and all that sort of stuff. It's really interesting history to me. Some of it is, well, most of it is based upon the scriptures. There's a non-canonical book called, if I had my chart here, I would have been up here. There's a non-canonical 4th book of Ezra. In other words, it's an ancient manuscript, but it's not part of our Bible. But it says it restores the law that was destroyed in the burning of the temple in Jerusalem. This book says Ezra dictated 24 books for the public, most of the Tanakh, and another 70 for the wise alone, 70 unnamed relevant works. And St. Jerome, the first translator of the Bible into Latin in the 4th century, said, "Whether you choose to call Moses the author of the Pentateuch or Ezra the renewer of the same work, I raise no objections." So I just think this is really interesting. And when we go to study the 1st, 2nd, through the 11th chapters of Genesis, some of the things that will become problematic are easily explained by saying, well, that was the P source. This is the J source. That's the reason you're reading them. And the reason they're together is because we think Ezra, the redactor, recognized the importance of all of them, and rather than throw any of them out, he put them all in. And how he did it is really a masterful element of editing, I guess, is the best way to say it. So that's the story. Next Sunday, we may finally get into the details of the book of Genesis. Let's bow our heads. Father, thank you for men like Ezra and those who preceded us centuries and millennia ago that recognized the importance of writing down the history of the Israelites and your relationship to them and to the first humans on the earth. May we learn from that. May we learn about how you relate to us and us relate to you. Be with each and every one of us today as we go about our business, and bring us all back safely next Sunday. In thy name we pray. Amen.
Amen.